all cultures from the beginning of human history have had the idea of reincarnation. That is, that human beings had a previous lifetime that affect this lifetime. This is a belief system that goes back to the early Aboriginal tribes. The oldest traditions are from Africa, where you had this concept of people being reborn into the next generation, from grandfather to granddaughter, from grandmother to grandson. It is also a tradition that goes back in ancient history in India. That concept has been here for 5,000-6,000 years or more. It is a part of all religious traditions, for example. Early Christianity had a belief in reincarnation based on the beliefs that the Hebrew people had in reincarnation. In the Bible itself, there's discussion of John the Baptist being the reincarnation of the prophet Elijah. So this concept of past lives being passed on to present lives is a long tradition. We don't know exactly what it means and how it works because there are many different beliefs about it. Most people have sort of a spiritual, ethereal concept of reincarnation. But in my research, in the reincarnation experiment that we're conducting in the United States and in other countries, is to look at the empirical scientific evidence that might have led ancient peoples to believe in the concept of reincarnation. It was not a concept that was invented. It was something based on evidence that they saw in their own lives. That's the most important question I think we can ask about the concept of reincarnation, and that we are asking it today in a scientific way that has never been asked before. Most people who believe in reincarnation think it is just something, as I have said before, ethereal or spiritual, where there's some connection with a previous lifetime, but it doesn't mean anything in this lifetime. But the evidence that we've accumulated over many years of research now is that if reincarnation is real, then it affects our real lives in very specific ways. One of those ways is in our physical features, in our facial structure, in our body type, in certain particular markings on our body, birthmarks and deformities in many cases, are scars. So there are physical implications of reincarnation. We are now beginning to try to develop a protocol for testing the DNA. Now, obviously this is a problem because most people who died in the past and are reincarnated today, we don't have DNA for them. But we are trying to establish the protocol today to calculate what are the DNA sequences, what are the locations in our genome that get passed from life to life that we can measure. So that's one very important area. And in my lecture, I show photographs of people who are living today, and also the portraits or sculptures or pictures of their previous lives, and you can see the correspondence. It is dramatic. It is almost as close, for the very strong cases, as the biometrics that's used in security cameras today when we're looking for a terrorist. We match the picture with the person and say, is that the same person? We can look at reincarnation cases and see just about the same degree of correspondence. So the physical impact is one, very important. And that includes predispositions for sports, for certain kinds of abilities, musical, artistic. That is part of this impact. There are other areas, what I call this personality or psychological areas, because as a psychologist, I've been most interested in the psychological impact of reincarnation. But we found that there are effects in the way we think, the way our mind works, whether we are analytical or intuitive, whether we think in the big picture or we're focused on the details. Those are differences that we have as individuals, and we find in the past lives that they correspond with the present life. So that's the thinking, the intellectual level of similarity between the past and the present. Another is what we call the ego type, which means our emotional profile. Are we happy, optimistic? Are we pessimistic? And so on. We have those characteristics in our personality, and the evidence suggests that we have a legacy from a previous lifetime that it doesn't shape you, it doesn't determine exactly, but it is a predisposition. It is a legacy that you start with as a child. Another area is in our interpersonal relationships. For example, are you an extrovert, sociable? Or are you a hermit who stays at home and you're shy and don't mix well with people? Those are extremes. But all of us have some profile like that, and what we see is in the past life that same pattern in the present life. That's the third psychological. The fourth is, what are we really interested in terms of our creative energy? If we have time, if we can choose a profession that we most feel comfortable with, the research we've done indicates that you come from the previous life with that inclination this time, as a pianist, as a musician, as a painter, as a sports person, as a physician, as a priest, as a nurse, as a farmer. All of these things, as a sailor, whatever your particular area of interest is, at a very young age, that is likely to be what your past life developed. So you have the physical and the psychological. So those are the implications for our present life. I need to make it clear that as a scientist, I think that we have to first have a hypothesis, and then we have to collect the evidence to evaluate whether or not our hypothesis is a valid one. In my view, in the field of reincarnation research, we only have a hypothesis at this point. So I cannot tell you this is absolute 100% proof of reincarnation. What I can tell you is that if we have certain kinds of evidence that are very strong, then we, in a scientific approach, can say, this person is possibly the reincarnation of that previous life. We can say, this person is likely to be the reincarnation. This person is quite likely. This person is very highly likely to be the only person living today who was the reincarnation of that past life. So you see, it's not 100%. It's 50% chance, 60% chance, 80% chance, 95% chance, 99% chance. So it's not definite proof. But from my point of view, in the best cases that we have, we can say in the strongest cases that Ms. X is more likely than anyone else in the whole world, the one person out of 6 billion in the whole world, if reincarnation is real, is the reincarnation of that person. And I use the case of Marilyn Monroe, for example. Everybody knows Marilyn Monroe. So we have a person, a Canadian woman, who, in our view, in this scientific approach, would say that if anyone in the world today is the reincarnation of Marilyn Monroe, it is most likely to be this person. And so that's the way we talk about proof. And by having all these different areas of evidence, we can say if the physical correspondences are very strong, the mental correspondences are very strong, the emotional, the interpersonal, and the creative interest, if all of those are very strong, we say, what other explanation could there be for this similarity other than reincarnation? It is the best explanation for the evidence that we have. I would like to first describe Mr. Plechkov in terms of the scientific experiment that we are conducting on reincarnation. Many clues about a possible previous lifetime comes through intuitive methods. All of us as humans have a level of intuition where we understand things that are not concrete before us. We are able to exercise some telepathic or some remote viewing or some precognitive. These are intuitive senses that all humans have, but some individuals have much more finely tuned intuition. They are able to see more of the universal field of consciousness where information is available to us humans. And Mr. Plechkov is one of those people. He, in his meditative practices, is able to relax his mind in such a way that his consciousness can see in areas and directions that most of us don't see on a regular basis. So in our reincarnation research project, we work with people like him and others to give us suggestions about possible past life connections. And then we take those suggestions and use our scientific method, using the 5 factors that I mentioned: the physical, the mental, the emotional, the interpersonal, and the creative areas of interest, to see how close those 2 lifetimes are. He has suggested several possible previous lifetime connections between some prominent Croatian people and people who lived in the 20th century or even in the 19th century. He has intuited some connections between Americans and Croatians, between current Americans and earlier Americans. What we have done is to take several of those cases and go through the process that I described earlier. We have taken pictures of both present and past lifetimes. We have measured them using biometric science, looking at the geometry of the bone structure and how the face is structured, the whole body, the whole genotype. And some of those similarities are so close that it's uncanny. You would almost say the person living today is the twin of that person who lived 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 200 years ago. And then when we look at the biography, and we look at the personality and the careers of these people, how they behave, how they relate to family members, all of these factors that we look at, we have found several very significant cases that I would place in the top level of our strongest cases. And I'll be talking about those at the lecture to show pictures and descriptions that indicate that, remember, let me express it this way, if reincarnation is real, then it is very likely that the people that we're talking about in the United States and in Croatia are the reincarnations of people that have been identified initially through this intuitive process. Well, I wrote this book, The Soul Genome, Science and Reincarnation, as a result of an experiment that we started some years ago to try to bring reincarnation into the scientific community based on empirical evidence. In other words, not something that a psychic tells us, or not something that one has a dream about and says, I am the reincarnation of Cleopatra because I dreamed I was, or because of hypnotic regression. These areas, hypnotic regression, dream therapy, psychic information, may be suggestions of a past life connection, but no one can prove them, no one can test them. So what we've done in our reincarnation experiment, and which is reported in this book, is we have taken those suggested past life connections and we have applied this scientific model of measurements using both physical tools and psychological tools to compare the similarities between the past life and the person living today. And what we've done is to develop a scientific concept that we call the psychoplasm. The popular term I'm using is the soul genome. What that does is it implies the traditional idea of the soul is somehow connected to our human genome. And the psychoplasm is just a Greek term to mean the container and all of the factors that are in it, which get passed from one generation to the other. Now, the interesting thing about, of course, reincarnation is that it doesn't always happen in the same family. In other words, it doesn't go from mother to daughter, mother to son, or grandfather to son necessarily. There are many cases where that seems to be the case, but most of the evidence suggests reincarnation from outside the family phylogenetic tree. And so this book raises the question, do we have any scientific evidence that such a mechanism, which is not just physical, but which involves information and energy and patterns and memories, and yes, the world of science today, in terms of physics, in terms of biology, in terms of genetics, in terms of evolutionary theory, all of these point to the notion that energetic information fields are the basis of life. Now, you can use the term soul genome for that, but I use terms as a scientist like biofields, information fields, energetic patterns that are embedded in the human at the point of conception, when you begin the process of developing a new being. And so the book really gives the evidence for that hypothesis. And I have to say that the scientific community as a whole is not yet ready to accept this notion. But what we're doing in our experiment is collecting the evidence, writing it down, photographing it, measuring it, evaluating it, so we have enough evidence that suggests that there is no better explanation for the evidence than reincarnation. Now, there are other theories like Carl Jung's archetype, like the Akashic records that are out there that Edgar Cayce and other psychics can read. But these explanations don't satisfy the evidence that I'm talking about. They can't account for the physical similarities that I'm talking about. That has to come through the genome. They can't really explain things about specific memories that no one else has had and that no one else has access to. So the scientific evidence, I believe, suggests that we have an individual psychoplasm or soul genome which is independent of a particular physical body, and that it incarnates in the process of conception and birth in the carry forward of that same legacy. Doesn't mean that we're going to be exactly the same person again, but it means that we start with the same legacy, the same predispositions. And then as we make choices in this lifetime, as our environment changes, as circumstances change, we grow and evolve. So back to the first question that you asked, what is the role of reincarnation? In my view, reincarnation is the essential mechanism by which the universe preserves consciousness and our learning, what we as individuals learn, and add to overall consciousness of the human species and all species. I would say if reincarnation exists, it exists not only among humans, but also among other species, whether on this planet or on any other planet. You have the same mechanism. Reincarnation is to consciousness, as Einstein's theory is, when he used the formula E equals mc squared, which says energy can be changed from one form to the other, but it cannot be destroyed. And I'm suggesting in reincarnation research that reincarnation is the law by which consciousness can be changed from one form to the other, but cannot be destroyed. That's the soul genome. I became interested in reincarnation research many, many years ago from a philosophical or religious orientation, trying to raise the question of what is the meaning of reincarnation as it has been used over the centuries. But I came to that work basically from my studies as a psychologist in graduate programs in my development as a professional. And I thought that I really wanted to apply a scientific and psychological perspective to the question of, is reincarnation anything more than simply a concept or a spiritual idea? So my background is in, my academic background is in clinical psychology and in personality theory. And as I began to read the work done by Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist in the United States who died in 2007, who's probably the most important scientific researcher in reincarnation to date. Looking at the evidence he collected and that other people collected, I began to see these patterns that I described as physical and personality factors. And this grew out of a perspective that only a psychologist who has been thinking about how humans develop and what shapes us into the kinds of personalities that we have. And when I began to look at the evidence, I began to realize that if reincarnation is real, then it is the most important factor in our development as personalities, as psychological, intellectual beings in a process of self-learning and self-development.